More than 3,500 Huguenots passed through the Château d'If after France outlawed their faith. The fortress itself could hold barely 200 people at a time. Most of the Huguenots were gone within weeks, marched onto galley ships waiting in the harbor below, and the record does not say how many of the 3,500 ever set foot on land again as free men. Most did not. 3 centuries later, this same island would become world famous for holding a prisoner who never actually existed. This is the story of a fortress built for an invasion that never came and used instead to make people disappear. This is the Château d'If. In January of 1516, King Francis I crossed the water to a small limestone island half a league off Marseille to look at a rhinoceros. The animal was a gift moving through Europe toward Rome, a curiosity from Portugal's trade with India, and it had been set down on the island of If to wait for a ship. Crowds rowed out to see it. Francois went with them, and while he was there, he noticed something the rhinoceros had not been brought to show him. The island sat squarely across the sea approach to Marseille's harbor, and nothing on that harbor could stop a fleet from sailing straight in. Francois was fresh off his victory at Marignano the autumn before. He was 21 years old, already Europe's most celebrated king. Marseille itself had only become fully French a few decades earlier, in 1481, and the city still ran much of its own affairs, wary of a crown that had absorbed it more through inheritance than conquest. A king eager to project strength over a port that had not entirely decided it wanted him there would notice an undefended sea approach and remember it. He filed the thought away. 8 years later, it stopped being theoretical. In 1524, an imperial army under the Constable de Bourbon laid siege to Marseille. For several tense weeks that summer, the city did not know whether it would hold. The Constable, once one of France's own most senior commanders before defecting to serve Charles V, knew the city's defenses from the inside, which made the threat considerably more credible than an ordinary foreign incursion might have been. He knew exactly where to strike. The siege ultimately failed, worn down more by logistics and disease within the besieging camp than by any dramatic French counterattack, but the scare exposed exactly what Francois had noticed from the water years earlier: a busy Mediterranean port with almost nothing guarding its own front door. Within the year, the order to fortify the island of If had been given. Construction began that year and finished in July of 1531. A square building 3 stories tall, 28 meters on each side, with 3 towers built to carry heavy guns. It never fired one of them in anger. No enemy fleet ever tested Château d'If. The nearest it came to combat was in 1531, when Holy Roman Emperor Charles V made preparations for another run at Marseille and then called the whole thing off. Vauban later inspected the fortifications and reportedly doubted they would have held under a serious attack. A professional opinion the fortress was never required to prove or disprove, because nobody ever tried. On paper, then, Château d'If was a deterrent. In practice, a fortress that never has to fight is a fortress with an empty payroll and a lot of very secure rooms. Deterrent is doing a lot of work in that sentence. That is the part the official histories tend to skip past. Marseille's own citizens had opposed the fortress in the first place. The city had only been folded into the Kingdom of France in 1481, and it was not eager to have a royal garrison sitting in its harbor mouth. Nobody asked the city's permission, so the crown had a fortress it had built for a war that never happened, on an island the locals resented, guarded by a current so strong that boats still avoid the north side of the island today. Somewhere in the middle of the 16th century, someone in the administration worked out what all of that added up to. It was not really a fortress anymore, not quite a prison yet either. It was a cell with a view. The fortress became a prison within a few decades of its completion, and the transition required almost nothing new to be built. The island did the work a wall usually does. The current running between If and the mainland moves fast enough that even strong swimmers avoid it on ordinary days, and Marseille's own harbor pilots still treat the passage with respect. France did not need to reinforce the towers or dig a moat. It needed a boat schedule and a jailer, which is to say, the empire built one thing and got 2 for the price of it. A fortress that never fired a shot became a prison that, for more than 300 years, would hold everyone from Protestant families to French revolutionaries to a novelist's imaginary sea captain who was never actually inside its walls. Only one of those tenants was fictional. The building itself is simple enough to describe in one breath. A stone square, 28 meters on a side, 3 stories, 3 towers, sitting on bare rock with almost no soil and no fresh water of its own. Everything the garrison needed, food, water, firewood, prisoners, arrived by boat. That single fact did more to keep men inside than any lock ever did. The island itself offered nothing to sustain a garrison, let alone a population of prisoners. 3 hectares of exposed limestone, without soil deep enough for a proper garden, and without a spring of drinkable water, meant that everyone stationed there, guards, commandant, and prisoners alike, depended entirely on boats arriving from Marseille on schedule. A single bad storm could cut the island off for days. Guards posted to Château d'If were, in their own way, almost as confined as the men they watched, separated from the mainland by the same current and the same weather, with only the freedom to leave once their rotation ended. The Rock did not discriminate. The fortress received one significant upgrade in its 4 centuries of service, and even that came for military reasons rather than penal ones. In the early 18th century, the engineer Vauban, the same military architect responsible for fortifying half the borders of France, inspected Château d'If and added lower coastal gun batteries and a barracks to modernize its defenses against ships that, once again, never came. The barracks Vauban built would later house guards rather than soldiers repelling an invasion. France's greatest military engineer spent his skill on a building that never fought an outside enemy. Its only real enemy turned out to be its own prisoners' hope of leaving. Inside, the building split into 2 very different prisons occupying the same walls. On the ground floor sat the Cachots, windowless dungeon cells cut into the rock itself, damp, unheated, and built to hold far more men than any modern building code would allow. 20 or more prisoners to a room was not unusual. There was no fireplace down there and no window to mark the hour. A man could lose track of the season before he lost track of the day. Then 1 floor up, the arrangement changed completely. Prisoners who could pay, and it did not take a fortune, only more than the men in the Cachots had, could rent what the administration called a pistolet, a private cell with an actual window, a fireplace, sometimes a small privy of its own. Honoré Mirabeau, locked up here in 1774 for a scandal involving his own family, rather than any crime against the state, held his pistole for the better part of a year, and by several accounts, used it to host guests. He was, by any definition, still a prisoner. Here is the part that the postcards tend to leave off the caption. The wall between a pistole and a cachot was often only as thick as the floor above it. 2 men could serve the same sentence, inside the same fortress, separated by a few feet of stone and an amount of money, and one of them would leave with his health, and the other, quite often, would not leave at all. Money bought air and light. Nobody wrote a regulation that said the poor should die faster in French state prisons. Nobody needed to. The pricing did that work on its own, and the paperwork simply recorded the results without ever using a word that made the arithmetic obvious. That is not a figure of speech. Prison registers from this period record separate mortality patterns for pistole tenants and cachot inmates without ever explaining the gap, because from the administration's point of view, there was nothing to explain. A man had chosen his cell the same way he chose his ship's cabin, and if he could not afford better, that was between him and his circumstances. By then, the fortress had also developed its own quiet bureaucracy of privilege. What decided a prisoner's floor was never his crime. It was never his sentence either. It was what he could pay on arrival, which meant a man convicted of treason with wealthy relations might have a better view of Marseille than a debtor with none. The architecture never changed to reflect this. It did not need to. The pricing was already doing the sorting, 1 prisoner at a time, for as long as the fortress operated as a prison at all. Then there's the water itself, which did more work than the walls. The current running past the island moves fast enough that local sailors still route around the northern shore rather than cut straight across it. Stand at the edge of that current even now, on the warmest day of a Marseille August, and the cold still reaches you within a minute. The sea has not gotten any warmer. A man who went into it in the 18th century did not simply need to be a strong swimmer. He needed to survive a current capable of pulling a rowboat off course in water cold enough to slow his arms almost immediately, with a fortress full of guards watching him do it. And that was the point. Nobody at Château d'If needed to build a second wall because the sea was already doing the job for free, every hour of every day, in every direction a man might choose to run. The tide worked the night shift too. The building that resulted from all of this was never meant to be a monument to cruelty. On paper, it was a defensive structure with a jail attached almost as an afterthought. That was the paperwork. In practice, it became a machine for sorting Frenchmen by what they could pay, and the ocean around it made sure that sorting held. The sea did not care who anyone was. The first prisoner history remembers is a knight named Anselme, locked up in 1580 on a charge of plotting against the crown. What happened to him afterward is one of the things the record simply does not say. His name survives. The rest of his file does not. For roughly a century after that, the island's population came and went without much of a pattern. Smugglers, debtors, the occasional nobleman who had said something unwise at court. Then in October of 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes and made Protestant worship illegal across France, and the pattern changed overnight. The island filled fast. More than 3,500 Huguenots were processed through Château d'If in the years that followed. The fortress, remember, could hold barely 200 people in anything resembling normal conditions. It held them anyway, packed into the cachots below the pistoles, men and women whose only offense was attending the wrong church on a Sunday. Families were frequently separated in the process, men held at If itself, while wives and children were routed to other fortresses along the coast, with no guarantee any of them would end up in the same place again, let alone learn where the others had gone. Nobody kept them together on purpose. Conditions in the lower cells during this period were bad enough that mortality among the Huguenot detainees is recorded, if imprecisely, as noticeably higher than among ordinary criminal prisoners held in the same building. A difference the surviving registers note in passing as a matter of administrative fact rather than as anything requiring explanation. Most did not stay for years. They stayed for weeks, sometimes days, before being marched down to the harbor and loaded onto the galley ships that were waiting for exactly this kind of cargo. On paper, a transfer to the galleys was simply a change of custody. In practice, the galleys were worse than the fortress in almost every way that mattered. A man sentenced to the oars rarely served a short term and rarely came home from a long one. Few came home at all. So the island's role in the story of the Huguenots was not really that of a prison at all. It was closer to a loading dock, a place where a family's faith was converted on paper into a labor sentence, and the labor sentence was carried out somewhere else entirely, out of sight of whoever was keeping the register at If. The arithmetic on that is worth doing slowly. 3,500 people is not a rounding error in a coastal town's population. It is a sustained operation, run for years, processing a specific category of French citizen through a specific island for a specific administrative purpose, with a paper trail thin enough that historians still argue over exactly how many never made it home. The island's guest list did not stay confined to the living. In 1800, General Jean-Baptiste Kléber, one of the revolution's most capable commanders, was assassinated in Cairo while commanding French forces in Egypt. His embalmed body was shipped home, and then, on Napoleon's own order, it was not buried. No funeral. No grave. Napoleon feared that a funeral fit for Kléber's reputation would hand the Republican opposition a martyr, so the coffin was placed inside Château d'If instead and left there. It remained on the island for 18 years, longer than most living prisoners served, until King Louis XVIII finally allowed a proper burial in Kléber's native Strasbourg. 18 years is a long time to be afraid of a dead man. For nearly 2 decades then, the most secure resident of a fortress built to hold France's enemies was a dead war hero the government itself was afraid of. The living prisoners, meanwhile, kept arriving. One floor up from where the Huguenots had waited for their ships a century earlier, a very different kind of prisoner was living an almost recreational sentence. Honoré Mirabeau arrived in 1774, sent by his own father under lettre de cachet, rather than any court judgment, for conduct the family considered an embarrassment rather than a crime. He kept his pistole for the better part of a year. Several accounts describe him hosting visitors there, and at least one describes something close to a party. 2 prisoners then, separated by a staircase, a fee, and roughly a century. And both of them officially guests of the same French state. The pattern held for more than a century after the Huguenots were gone. When Paris rose up in June of 1848, around 120 people arrested in the unrest were shipped to Château to wait out the crisis somewhere the government did not have to look at them. Marseille had its own island for that. Some of them scratched words into the stone of the courtyard while they waited. Dates, initials, the occasional slogan. Above the old entrance to that same courtyard, someone carved a phrase that has outlasted every regime that has controlled the island since. Hôtel du peuple souverain. Hotel of the sovereign people. Nobody signed it. Nobody needed to. If there is another island prison you would like this channel to go inside next, the comments are read. Hundreds of names passed through that gate before anyone stayed long enough, or strangely enough, to be remembered by it. One man managed both. The man who came closest arrived in 1877, an old man already on a boat that made this crossing without any of the ceremony that had once surrounded political prisoners of his rank. His name was Louis-Auguste Blanqui, and by the time he reached Château, he had already spent more than 3 decades of his 72 years behind one set of bars or another. The French called him l'enfermé, the locked up one. The nickname was not an exaggeration. He had been imprisoned under the July Monarchy, under the Second Republic, under the Second Empire. Now, under the Third Republic, he was back again. 4 regimes that agreed on almost nothing except that Blanqui needed to be somewhere they could watch him. Blanqui's file by 1877 was already remarkable on its own terms. He had been locked up after an armed rising in 1839, again after another rising in 1848, sent briefly into penal exile in Algeria in the 1850s, imprisoned again through most of the 1860s, and arrested a final time in 1871 for his role. However distant in the Paris uprising, he had been too far away and too unwell to actually join. Every regime that had governed France since his youth, kings, emperors, and republics alike, had, at one point or another, decided the safest place for Auguste Blanqui was somewhere with a locked door. He was not a soldier and never claimed to be one. Blanqui was a revolutionary in the older, more literal sense of the word, a man who believed a small, disciplined group of committed people could seize the state on behalf of everyone else, hold it briefly, and hand power to the working class before the old order recovered its footing. Each attempt had failed. Each failure had cost him years. Then by the time he arrived at If, the state had mostly stopped trying to execute him and settled instead into a routine of simply putting him somewhere quiet, which is to say, the French Republic had run out of new punishments to give a 72-year-old man and settled for the oldest one it had. Prison was still prison. Here's the part that turns this from a footnote into a story worth stopping for. In April of 1879, while Blanqui was still confined on the island, the voters of Bordeaux elected him to a seat in the Chamber of Deputies. He had not campaigned. He could not have campaigned. He was sitting in a fortress cell 300 kilometers away while the votes were counted. Bordeaux elected him anyway, fully aware of where he was and why, which makes the result less an accident of paperwork and more a message the voters were sending directly past their own government and out toward an island in the Mediterranean. The chamber did not appreciate the message. Within weeks, the deputies voted to invalidate Blanqui's election on the grounds that a man serving a sentence could not hold office, a rule that was, on paper, entirely consistent with French law, and that happened, in practice, to remove the one democratically elected voice that had just told the government it disagreed with keeping him locked up. Somebody signed that. The name is in the file. The invalidation did not end the story the way the government might have hoped. If anything, it did the opposite. An old revolutionary who had spent most of his life as a minor irritant to whichever regime happened to be in power suddenly became, for a few months in 1879, one of the most discussed men in France, not because of anything he had done from inside his cell, but because of what an election result said about a government that would rather nullify a vote than answer for a prisoner. The message landed anyway. By June of 1879, under mounting public pressure and a general amnesty extended to the last of the communards and their sympathizers, Blanqui was released. He left Château an old man in poor health, having spent roughly 33 years of his 74 on earth behind bars of one kind or another. Freedom came late. He would live another year and a half, long enough to see his own name become a shorthand. Blankism, for the idea that a small, committed vanguard could do what a slow-moving majority never quite managed. That idea outlived him by decades. Revolutionaries who never met Blanqui, some not even born when he died on the 1st of January, 1881, would later credit him as a direct influence on their own thinking about how power actually changes hands, not through patient persuasion in their reading of him, but through the decisive action of a prepared few at the right moment. He had lived the theory first. Whatever one makes of the argument, it is difficult to separate it from the man who spent 33 years testing, in practice, exactly how much a state was willing to do to keep one stubborn believer quiet. He was not the first prisoner of conscience this island held. He would not be the last. What made him different was not the sentence. Fortresses across the Mediterranean were full of old men serving time for beliefs their governments found inconvenient. What made Blanqui different was that, for a few weeks in the spring of 1879, the machinery of French democracy accidentally proved his entire argument for him, that the system could be made to answer to power, when it wanted to, faster than it would ever answer to a vote. Blanqui left the island an old man, pardoned. 8 years earlier, another prisoner had left it a different way. His name was Gaston Crémieux, a lawyer from Nimes who had spent his career defending clients too poor to pay him properly, work that had made him more popular among Marseille's working poor than among the city's own lawyers. It was that popularity, not any particular talent for insurrection, that put him at the head of a movement he had not planned and, by several accounts, did not fully believe could succeed. He was, in his own words, a reluctant leader. The Paris Commune itself had been declared in March after France's catastrophic defeat in the war with Prussia left the capital angry, armed, and unwilling to accept the peace terms Paris felt had been forced on it. The idea spread south within days, carried by telegraph and by returning soldiers, and Marseille was one of several provincial cities that tried, briefly, to follow the capital's example. None of the provincial communes lasted as long as Paris did. Marseille's collapsed in a little over 2 weeks once the army decided the uprising was worth the cost of putting down by force rather than waiting it out. Toulouse and Narbonne, which had risen in sympathy around the same time, fell within days of each other in the same sweep. A reminder that Marseille's rebellion was never an isolated event, so much as one flare in a chain reaction running the length of southern France that spring, extinguished city by city as the national government reasserted control. Which is to say, Marseille never really stood a chance. Crémieux was not, by most accounts, a natural revolutionary. One contemporary who knew him well described him as an elegant, almost gentle speaker who saw the coming struggle in something closer to poetic terms than military ones. That did not stop the city from making him its leader when the moment arrived. Then the government sent troops. Crémieux was arrested and brought before a military court, which is not, on paper, the same thing as a civilian trial, and which, in practice, tends to produce a narrower range of verdicts. He was held at Château while the case against him worked its way through the system. He was sentenced to death in June. The execution itself was delayed for nearly 6 months, long enough that some in Marseille began to believe the delay itself was a kind of mercy, that the government had quietly decided an old lawyer with a gift for speeches was not worth the trouble of killing. They were wrong. On the 30th of November, 1871, Crémieux was taken from his cell. By most English-language accounts, the sentence was carried out on the island itself. At least one detailed contemporary record places the firing squad instead on the Prado, a stretch of open ground on the Marseille mainland where an earlier execution from the same uprising had already taken place that autumn. The record does not say exactly where the shots were fired. It says only that Crémieux did not leave imprisonment alive, and that whichever ground he was standing on, he asked to keep his eyes unbandaged and to give the order himself. He asked the soldiers to aim for his chest rather than his head, so that his parents would not have to see the damage. According to the account that survives, they agreed. His last words, delivered as the rifles came up, were reported as "Vive la République," "Long live the Republic," and the sentence was reportedly cut short by the volley before he finished it. That is not a figure of speech. The report exists in more than one written account from the period, cross-referenced against each other, rather than invented for effect. There's a line in that record worth sitting with. Crémieux did not die pleading. He died correcting the aim. His execution effectively ended Château d'If's use as a site of political killing, though not, as later prisoners like Blanqui would demonstrate, its use as a place to put political inconvenience out of public view. The fortress had spent nearly 300 years absorbing France's dissidents in one form or another, Protestants under the old kings, revolutionaries under the new republics, and Crémieux's death on or near that island stands as close to a full stop on that function as the record allows. By then, France itself was changing. The Third Republic that had ordered Crémieux's death would, within a decade, extend an amnesty to the communards it had crushed, the same amnesty that would eventually open Blanqui's cell door 6 years after Crémieux's closed for good. Governments change their minds. The government that killed one prisoner for his politics would pardon the next one for the same offense, and the fortress that had held them both would never again be asked to hold a man for what he believed. A new island prison goes up on this channel every week. If this one has held your attention this far, the subscribe button is below. There was one more surge of prisoners before the numbers began their final decline. When Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup on the 2nd of December, 1851, the crackdown that followed swept up tens of thousands of people across France. By some counts, more than 26,000 arrests nationwide, with roughly 9,500 deported to Algeria and several hundred more sent onward to the penal colony at Cayenne. Marseille's share of that roundup filled Château d'If past anything it had held in decades. 304 men, crammed into a fortress built for a fraction of that number, waiting for a ship that would take them to Algiers or across the Atlantic to French Guiana. Most were gone within weeks. The routine barely changed. The fortress that had once processed Huguenots toward the galleys processed this new wave of prisoners toward an entirely different kind of exile, using the same cells, the same ferry schedule, and very nearly the same paperwork. The fortress kept operating as a prison for almost 20 more years after Crémieux's death, though its role kept shrinking. Change came slowly. By the final decades of the 19th century, France's prison system had modernized around it. Purpose-built penitentiaries on the mainland, standardized sentencing, a bureaucracy that no longer needed an island fortress to solve the simple problem of where to put someone inconvenient. On paper, this was simply progress. In practice, the new penitentiaries followed principles the old island fortresses had never been designed around. Standardized cell sizes, formal visiting hours, sentences tracked by a central ministry rather than left to the judgment of a single commandant offshore. An island prison that depended on weather could not compete on cost. Not anymore. The transfer to civilian hands happened gradually rather than through any single decree. Military use wound down through the 1870s and 1880s, even as the prison technically remained in operation for select cases, until the Army finally released its hold on the island altogether. No ceremony marked the change. No single official is remembered for making the decision. The fortress simply moved, one small administrative transfer at a time, from the columns of a military ledger to the columns of a tourism one. Decades later, during the First World War, the fortress took in one final category of resident. German prisoners of war, held briefly rather than for the years that had once defined a sentence at If, in a building that by then functioned more as overflow storage for an empire's worth of captured soldiers than as a prison in its own right. Nobody closed Château d'If in disgrace. There was no scandal, no press expose, no royal commission forced to explain a mortality rate, or a buried set of records. Nothing dramatic ended it. The prison simply stopped being useful, the way a tool stops being useful once better tools exist, and the French state let it go quiet rather than shutting it down all at once. Exactly when the doors opened to the public afterward is one of the few points where even the fortress's own historians disagree with each other. Even they cannot agree on the year. The most commonly cited date puts the opening in September of 1890, after the site had been demilitarized and handed over for public visits. The Château's own visitor materials, however, describe the site as having welcomed its first unofficial guests as early as 1880, drawn less by the history of the building than by a novel that had already made the place famous half a century earlier. Both dates appear in serious sources. Neither is treated as controversial by the people who study the site. The record simply was not kept with an eye toward a future documentary asking for the exact year, and it shows. Which is, in its own way, the most honest thing that can be said about how this particular prison ended. No single door slammed shut. It was a slow administrative shrug, recorded imprecisely because nobody at the time thought that precision would matter to anyone. What did matter, almost immediately, was the fiction. Alexandre Dumas had published The Count of Monte Cristo in serial form between 1844 and 1846, more than 4 decades before the fortress stopped holding prisoners at all. The timing matters. In the novel, a young sailor named Edmond Dantès is falsely accused of treason on his wedding day and thrown into Château without trial, where he spends 14 years in the company of a fellow prisoner, the Abbé Faria, before executing one of the literature's most famous escapes. Dumas set his fiction inside a real, still functioning prison. The crime was invented. The victim was invented. That combination alone guaranteed the fortress would outlive every other reason it had ever been built. Fiction moved in while the real prison was still open for business. By the time the real prison closed, tourists were already arriving asking to see Dantès' cell. No one named Dantes had ever been in it. The betrayal, the trial, the 14 years, none of it happened. The fortress accommodated them anyway. It still does. A roughly hewn dungeon on the site is maintained today expressly in Dantes' honor, marked and furnished for visitors who understand perfectly well that the man never existed and want to stand in his cell anyway. Nobody minds? The fiction pays better than the facts do. Then there is the harder question underneath all of that, the one the postcards do not ask. Why this particular fortress, and not one of the dozens of others, scattered across the Mediterranean that held real Huguenots, real revolutionaries, and real men who died for causes with names attached to them? The honest answer has very little to do with Blanqui, or Crémieux, or the 3,500 Huguenots who passed through on their way to the galleys. It has almost nothing to do with any of them. It has to do with a novelist's requirements. He needed an island close enough to Marseille to feel real, isolated enough that an escape felt impossible, already famous enough that nobody would need the setting explained to them. Château fit the requirements of a plot better than it ever fit the requirements of a headline. That is not a small distinction. It is the entire reason one French state prison is now more recognizable than almost any other. Other prisons held more people, held them longer, under worse conditions. Their names belong to specialists now, and almost no one else. Fiction travels lighter than fact. None of that fully explains why roughly 100,000 people still cross that same stretch of water every year to see the place for themselves. The reason was never on the fortress's payroll, and it was never really about the fortress at all. Dumas did not invent his revenge story from nothing. Years before the Count of Monte Cristo, a Paris police archivist named Jacques Pochet published the case history of a shoemaker from Nîmes, a man usually remembered as François or Pierre Picot, who had been falsely denounced as a spy by 3 jealous friends in 1807 and imprisoned for it. He lost 7 years to that lie. Picot spent roughly 7 years locked away before his release, discovered a hidden fortune, and spent what remained of his life exacting a long, methodical revenge on the men who had destroyed him. Dumas read the case file, acknowledged it by name in his own notes, and built Edmond Dantès almost directly on top of it. It was not a happy ending either way. Picot's own fate was worse than Dantès'. His campaign of revenge eventually drew the attention of a former associate named Antoine Alou, who recognized what Picot was doing and, rather than exposing him, decided to profit from the knowledge instead. Blackmail seemed safer than justice. When Picot refused to pay for his silence, Alou had him abducted and, in the struggle that followed, fatally wounded him. Police recorded Picot's dying confession before he died of his injuries. Then, decades later, dying himself in a poor district of London, Alou finally told a priest the whole story on the understanding that it could be passed to the French police only after his own death, which is how an archivist in Paris ever came to have the case file that would, years afterward, end up on Alexandre Dumas' desk. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the gift shop. Picot was never imprisoned at Château. Not for one day. His sentence was served at the Fenestrelle fortress in the mountains of Piedmont, several hundred kilometers away, and an entire country apart from the island Dumas chose for his novel. The real betrayal, the real years in a cell, the real revenge, all of it happened somewhere else, to a man whose name almost nobody visiting the fortress today has ever heard. The island holds 2 other ghosts it never actually earned as well. Popular legend has long linked Château d'If to the Man in the Iron Mask, one of the 18th century's most durable mysteries. A prisoner whose face was reportedly never shown to his guards. The historical record places that prisoner at the island of Sainte Marguerite, off Cannes, and later at the Bastille in Paris, where he died in 1703. He was never held here, not even close. Nor, despite a rumor repeated often enough to feel like fact, was the Marquis de Sade, a claim that shows up regularly in casual accounts of the fortress and appears nowhere in the prisoner records the site itself maintains. Which is to say, the three most famous names associated with this island, Dantes, the Man in the Iron Mask, and the Marquis de Sade, never set foot inside it. Not one of them. The fortress built its worldwide reputation almost entirely on absence. Meanwhile, the men who actually were here, the 3,500 Huguenots, marched down to the galleys. The Knight Anselme, whose fate the record never recorded, Mirabeau hosting guests one floor above men who would not survive the winter, Crémieux correcting his own firing squad's aim, Blanqui winning an election from inside a cell, remain for most visitors a footnote to a novel none of them appear in. Their names are still in the register. The site has been officially protected as a historic monument since 1926, and today it is managed by France's Centre des Monuments Nationaux. The same body responsible for far grander chateaux across the country, tending among its more famous holdings to a fortress whose international fame rests almost entirely on people who were never actually here. Somebody has to. Château d'If still stands on its 3 hectares of bare rock, 28 meters on a side, the current still running past it fast enough that the ferry back to the mainland takes longer than the ferry out. The cell maintained in Dantes' honor still draws a line of visitors most afternoons, waiting to stand somewhere no one named Dantes ever stood. A few steps away, largely unvisited, sits the record of everyone who actually did. We go inside the places empires built beyond their own borders, one island at a time, and the empires built a great many of them,